Forget everything you think you know about the conflict between China and Taiwan. Forget the history books, forget the diplomatic footnotes. This is not a civil war. This is not a simple border dispute. This is a cold, calculated $7 trillion ticking time bomb that threatens to detonate the entire global economy. We are going to expose why a tiny island in the Pacific, smaller than West Virginia, holds the complete unchecked power to destroy your smartphone, paralyze your car, and cripple the most advanced military on Earth. What if I told you that the ultimate prize for Beijing isn't just a patch of land, but the complete unchecked domination of the world's oceans? What if the U.S. defense of Taiwan is not a defense of democracy, but a cold, calculated corporate protection racket? And what if the fate of Hong Kong, that brutal, televised crackdown, was simply the opening act of a much larger, much darker play? In this video, we will rip apart the propaganda, expose the hidden lines drawn in blood and oil, and reveal why Taiwan is not a country, not a province, but the undisputed, high-stakes key to a new world order.
The year is 1949. The place is the mainland coast of China. This is not a triumphant scene. This is a rout. This is the final, desperate act of the Chinese Civil War. A retreating army, the nationalist Kuomintang, and approximately 2 million desperate refugees are fleeing for their lives. Their destination? A small, semi-tropical island 180 kilometers away across a treacherous strait. They are running from the unstoppable red tide of Mao Zedong's communists. They call this the Great Retreat, a massive, traumatic wound on the body of China. For the fleeing nationalists, it was exile. But for the victors, for the Chinese Communist Party, for the regime that built the modern superpower of the People's Republic of China, this final, tiny gap left a fissure in the soul of the nation. That fissure is Taiwan, and it is, in Beijing's eyes, the most dangerous scar left by a century of humiliation. To understand why China must invade Taiwan, why it's a non-negotiable existential mandate, you must discard the Western idea of politics. This isn't a border dispute over a few miles of mud. This is about legitimacy. The Chinese Communist Party, which rules over 1.4 billion people, justifies its absolute one-party rule on a single powerful promise: that it saved China. That it was the only force capable of ending the century of humiliation, a dark era stretching from the Opium Wars of the 1840s to the Civil War of 1949. Foreign powers humiliated China. They dictated treaties, stole territory, and crippled the ancient state. Mao and the CCP promised to end that era forever. They largely did, reclaiming Hong Kong and Macau and consolidating the mainland. But there is one single tiny piece of territory that remains outside their grasp. A territory that was lost to the Japanese in 1895, recovered in 1945, and then stolen again by the remnants of the very army the CCP defeated. Taiwan is the unfinished business. It is the proof, flickering every day just across the strait, that the CCP's promise of total national restoration is a lie. If the CCP allows Taiwan to become formally and permanently independent, it doesn't just lose an island, it loses its right to rule. It confirms that it failed to complete the mission, opening a fatal political wound that could unravel the entire political system. For Beijing, the issue is settled. Taiwan is a renegade province. Its continued existence as a separate entity is a standing insult to the sacrifices of the revolution. Its independence would be a direct, unforgivable betrayal of the entire national rejuvenation narrative. Xi's dream, the mandate of heaven, redefined.
This mission, this sacred commitment, has been amplified to a deafening roar by one man, President Xi Jinping. His signature political philosophy, the China Dream, is not a vision of personal prosperity. It is an explicitly nationalistic rallying cry for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. When Xi talks about rejuvenation, he's not talking about economic growth. He is invoking the mandate of heaven, the ancient Chinese concept that justifies imperial rule. He's saying the CCP has been chosen by history to restore China to its rightful, dominant place in the world. And in that vision, an independent Taiwan is simply unthinkable. Xi has tied the completion of this dream directly to a timeline. The year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. By that date, the nation must be unified. This is not a suggestion. It is a political deadline. And this brings us to the second, more dangerous threat Taiwan poses to the CCP, the ideological contagion. Taiwan has done the unforgivable. It has transformed itself from a brutal, one-party dictatorship, the KMT, into a vibrant, flawed, but undeniable democracy. It's proof that a Chinese-speaking society steeped in Confucian culture can thrive under Western-style pluralism. If Taiwan can be free, why can't the mainland? Taiwan's democracy is a mirror that Beijing cannot allow its people to look into. It's the ultimate ideological counter-narrative. The CCP fears a Taiwanese invasion less than it fears the export of the democratic idea. Reunification, therefore, is not just about regaining territory. It is about stamping out the democratic virus that threatens the CCP's one-party monopoly on power. The trauma of 1949, a nation's shame. To grasp the emotional fuel driving Beijing, we must re-examine the trauma of 1949. When the KMT government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan, they took everything of value. They emptied the national treasury of its gold reserves, they loaded priceless cultural artifacts, the very symbols of Chinese civilization, onto ships. And they left the newly formed People's Republic of China bankrupt and stripped bare. The National Palace Museum in Taipei doesn't just hold art. It holds the physical inheritance of the Chinese Empire. For many mainland Chinese, that collection is stolen loot. It's a painful symbol of the humiliation of being left behind by the defeated regime, which then established a government in exile that claimed to be the sole legitimate ruler of all China for decades. This is the psychological core of the current animosity. The CCP sees itself as the legitimate inheritor of the entire Chinese state, but the spoils of war, the gold, the art, the final crucial piece of territory slipped through their fingers and remain in the hands of their defeated enemy. It is the ultimate what-if moment in modern Chinese history. What if Mao had been able to launch the massive seaborne invasion he planned? It would have been the largest amphibious landing in history. The Civil War would have been concluded. The wound would have healed. The fact that they failed, that the enemy escaped with the treasury and the crown jewels, is the greatest, most profound failure in the CCP's founding mythology. Invading Taiwan is not just foreign policy, it is the ultimate historical correction. It is the final, bloody victory that Mao was denied. The two China's conundrum, ideological warfare. The legal absurdity of the situation only adds fuel to the fire. For decades, both Beijing and Taiwan agreed on one core principle: there is only one China. They simply disagreed on who had the right to rule it. Taipei, for decades, claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire mainland. Beijing, since 1949, has maintained that the ROC government on Taiwan is an illegal, temporary remnant. Over time, the world shifted. Slowly, deliberately, Beijing used its economic and diplomatic power to isolate Taiwan. The 1971 United Nations vote, which ceded the PRC and expelled the ROC, was the diplomatic death blow. Since then, almost every major country, including the United States, recognizes the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. But here is the critical, dangerous twist. As Taiwan evolved into a democracy, its people began to forge a separate, independent identity. They stopped clinging to the idea of ruling the mainland and embraced the idea of being a sovereign Taiwanese nation. This is the red line. For the CCP, a democratic Taiwan that simply claims to be China is tolerable. It's an internal affair. A democratic Taiwan that officially declares itself independent and establishes a separate, permanent legal state, that is a declaration of war. The invasion of Taiwan is therefore a political imperative for Xi Jinping. It secures the final piece of the China dream. It destroys the ideological threat of Chinese-speaking democracy. And most crucially, it completes the great historical project of the Chinese Communist Party, the final and total reversal of the century of humiliation. It is a mission that Beijing cannot afford to fail, regardless of the cost in blood, treasure, or global stability. The world is looking at a geopolitical conflict. Beijing is looking at a required historical ceremony.
If the historical motive for invading Taiwan is about emotion and ideology, the military motive is about geography and sheer power. For decades, China's global ambition has been trapped, locked behind what geopolitical strategists call the first island chain. This arc of islands, dominated by U.S. allies, Japan, the Philippines, and most critically, Taiwan, is a naval prison. Look at the map. Every time a Chinese warship or submarine wants to reach the open Pacific, it must squeeze through narrow Allied-controlled choke points, the Tsushima Strait, the Miyako Strait, or the Bashi Channel. The instant they do, they are tracked, monitored, and exposed. Taiwan is not just an island in this chain, it is the cork in the bottle. If the People's Liberation Army, PLA, seizes Taiwan, the first island chain is shattered. Taiwan is immediately converted from a U.S. barrier into a forward operating base for the PLA Navy. This is the ultimate existential geopolitical breakthrough. The Deepwater Gamble, the Eastern Front. The strategic value is hidden on Taiwan's quiet, heavily defended east coast. The Taiwan Strait is shallow and easily mined. It's a logistics nightmare for an invasion force. But the east coast? That's where the mountains plunge straight into deep, open water. And that water is the submariner's paradise. Deepwater ports like Hualien and Suo are currently used for bulk cargo and tourism. But for a hostile power, they are the key to a blue water future. If China controls them, their rapidly expanding fleet of advanced nuclear-capable submarines, the deadliest, most secretive tools of modern naval power, gain immediate, unrestricted access to the vast, deep basins of the Pacific Ocean. By taking Taiwan, Beijing doesn't just gain a coastline. It gains the ability to hide its nuclear deterrent from U.S. surveillance and project power globally, essentially leapfrogging decades of naval containment strategy. The first island chain collapses. The U.S. defense perimeter is pushed back thousands of miles, and the PALN becomes a true, unconstrained global force. This is the military jackpot, a complete paradigm-shifting transformation of the world's naval balance of power. The economic prize, the $1.5 trillion grab. If the geopolitical prize is the ocean, the economic prize is far more immediate and, frankly, far more valuable. Taiwan is not a backwater province. It is an economic titan. Its nominal GDP is roughly $885 billion annually, with a purchasing power parity nearing $2 trillion.
We can conservatively frame the entire economy as a $1.5 trillion jackpot that Beijing is desperate to claim. But the sheer size of the economy is secondary to its quality. Taiwan is a global powerhouse in everything from petrochemicals to precision machinery, but it is the electronics sector that makes the entire world tremble. The crown jewel, of course, is TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which we will dissect later. But the jackpot is bigger than one company. It includes chip design and packaging. Companies like MD Tech, a global leader in mobile chip design, and ASE, the world's largest chip packaging and testing company. Optoelectronics and display. Expertise in advanced screens and display technologies, crucial for everything from fighter jets to future VR systems. Precision manufacturing. The deep, irreplaceable talent pool and supply chain that supports the entire high-tech global ecosystem. If China successfully absorbs this entire ecosystem, they don't just solve their own massive technological deficits, their crippling chip dependency. They gain leverage over every major global competitor, the US, Japan, Europe. Beijing becomes the silicon hegemon. They control the flow of the most critical resource on the planet, giving them economic and industrial power that far exceeds any simple oil embargo. It is the ultimate fusion of Xi Jinping's ambition, militaristic control backed by technological supremacy. Shattering the American system, the psychological warfare. The third and arguably most intoxicating benefit for Beijing is purely psychological. It's the symbolic act of shattering the post-World War II security architecture built and maintained by the United States. For 80 years, the U.S. has been the undisputed power in the Pacific. It has drawn lines, signed treaties, and established a system of alliances built on an unshakable promise: we will come to the aid of our allies. Taiwan has always been the most ambiguous and yet most critical test of that promise. If China invades Taiwan and the U.S. either fails to intervene or worse, intervenes and is defeated, the psychological damage to the American security system is irreparable. Japan would immediately question the reliability of its defense treaty. South Korea would be forced to capitulate to Chinese strategic demands. Nations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific would conclude overnight that backing the U.S. is a losing bet, a dangerous gamble. They would flock to Beijing's orbit. An invasion of Taiwan is the ultimate credibility test for American global primacy. If the U.S. fails the test, if the flag of the People's Republic flies over Taipei, it signals the end of the American century in Asia. It proves that U.S. power is, in the face of a true peer competitor, nothing but a paper tiger. The psychological benefit for Xi Jinping is a massive domestic triumph, securing his legacy as the greatest leader since Mao, and a diplomatic tsunami for the United States, which would see its alliances crumble in rapid succession. A calculation of risk, the Chinese dilemma. So the calculation in Beijing is clear. The benefits are historic, economic, and existential. They gain the unhealed wound of 1949. They gain the unrestricted deepwater access to the Pacific. They gain the technological supremacy of the $1.5 trillion jackpot. And they gain the satisfaction of shattering the American-led world order in their own backyard. The question is not why they want Taiwan, but whether the magnitude of these benefits is worth the colossal cost of a full-scale war. Because while the jackpot is immense, the global reaction, the sanctions, the blood, the isolation will be a cost no nation has ever faced. And that is the risk they are currently calculating behind closed doors with a deadline fast approaching.
To understand the war for Taiwan, you must first understand the prison wall that defines China's destiny. For 7 decades, China has been contained, its maritime ambitions stifled by an invisible but brutally effective defense perimeter, a masterpiece of geopolitical engineering known as the First Island Chain. This isn't a wall of concrete,
but a wall of strategic geography, fortified by the power of the U.S. Navy and its treaty allies. It locks China's colossal, rapidly modernizing People's Liberation Army Navy, the PLAN, into the shallow, congested waters of the East and South China Seas. The Chinese Navy is like a giant trapped in a bathtub. Its entire eastern coastline, stretching thousands of miles, is effectively blinded and bottled up. Every significant port, every new aircraft carrier, every nuclear submarine must pass through a handful of narrow Allied-controlled passages to reach the freedom of the Pacific. Gate 1. The Miyako Strait, a mere 150 nautical miles wide, squeezed between two key Japanese islands. Every Chinese vessel passing through is immediately monitored by Japanese and U.S. intelligence, their signature recorded, their intent logged. Gate 2, the Bashi Channel, between Taiwan and the Philippines. The path for most Chinese submarines seeking the deep water. A narrow choke point, easily monitored by U.S. sensors and Allied assets. This containment, this tyranny of geography, is why Beijing views the existing status quo not merely as an inconvenience, but as an existential threat to its future as a global power. For decades, the U.S. strategy has been to ensure that any major Chinese naval deployment is known, tracked, and targetable from the moment it leaves port. The first island chain serves as a massive tripwire and killbox. A conflict beginning here means the PLN must fight its way out of the bottleneck under a relentless barrage from Allied air and sea power. The chain ensures that China's war is fought on their doorstep, not ours. The central failure of the U.S. strategy, in Beijing's view, is that the key to unlocking the entire system, the very hinge of the prison gate, is a small, autonomous island 100 miles from the mainland coast. The cork in the bottle. Taiwan is not just in the chain, it is the cork in the bottle. Its geography makes it the single most valuable piece of real estate in the Asia-Pacific. A 160-mile-long, unsinkable aircraft carrier, perfectly positioned to neutralize the strategic heart of the American alliance system. If China controls Taiwan, the entire first island chain becomes obsolete. The prison door doesn't just open, the prison wall itself is converted into a forward assault ramp against the remaining U.S. presence. The Taiwan Strait, the site of a likely invasion, is merely the means to an end. It is too shallow, too chaotic for strategic naval operations. The true prize is on the other side of the central mountain range. This is the key to the Pacific breakout. China's most advanced military assets are its nuclear ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. These are the nation's ultimate strategic deterrent, the crucial component of a guaranteed second strike capability. For these submarines to be effective, they need two things: deep water for silent running, and unrestricted access to patrol areas far from the mainland. The east coast of Taiwan provides both. Deep-water ports like Hualien, protected by towering mountains, offer perfect, virtually unmonitored staging and resupply points. Once a PLN SSBN slips out of Hualien, it is immediately in the vast, sonar-confounding depth of the Pacific. This is the strategic equation that keeps U.S. planners awake at night. A successful invasion of Taiwan instantly changes the rules of nuclear deterrence. Today, China's submarine fleet is relatively exposed as it attempts to break out. Tomorrow, operating from the lee side of Taiwan, their SSBNs can patrol far to the south and east, potentially placing U.S. cities, including the continental United States, under continuous, fully concealed, invulnerable Chinese nuclear patrol. The balance of power is not merely shifted, it is fundamentally destabilized. The island transforms from a democratic shield to a strategic fortress for China's most lethal weapons. The Great Neutralization. When the cork is removed, the second island chain suddenly comes into play. The strategic gravity of the Pacific shifts east toward Guam and Hawaii. China's objective, once Taiwan is secured, is the Great Neutralization, rendering the remaining U.S. and Allied bases militarily irrelevant.
Taiwan's fall doesn't just mean a loss of a partner.
It means the PLA immediately gains forward sensor posts, advanced radar facilities, and long-range missile sites positioned perfectly to target the most crucial Allied nodes. The Japan Gambit, Okinawa's obsolescence. Okinawa, home to U.S. Marine and Air Force power, Kadena Air Base, and Marine Corps Base Camp Smedley, becomes immediately vulnerable. Separated from Taiwan by only the narrowest of gaps, these bases, which have been the undisputed staging points for any Taiwan defense, are now within the outer ring of Chinese artillery. A captured Taiwan means the PLA can project constant air patrols and surface-to-air missile coverage directly over the shipping lanes connecting Okinawa to the fight. Kadena, once the spear tip of American power, becomes a target of opportunity. Its runways and hardened shelters now directly in the line of a massive, localized missile fusillade. For the U.S., any fight for the Taiwan Strait must now begin thousands of miles farther back. The Japanese security guarantee is fundamentally hollowed out. The Philippine collapse, the south flank exposed. The northernmost Philippine EDCA bases, intended to allow U.S. troops to quickly reinforce the Bashi Channel, become strategically useless. Why? Because a Chinese-controlled Taiwan is now between them and the mainland. Any U.S. effort to stage forces from the Philippines would require a massive naval armada to sail around Taiwan and into a potentially hostile Pacific, facing the newly unchained Chinese submarine force. The Philippines, facing an overwhelming power projection right across their narrow sea channel, would be compelled to expel the U.S. military presence, a profound psychological victory for Beijing. The true danger is not a single battle, but the speed of the collapse. The neutralization of these bases is not a consequence of defeat, but of geography. Once Taiwan falls, the dominoes do not start to fall, they have already fallen. The strategic logic dictating the defense of Southeast Asia is instantly reversed. Washington's credibility collapses, and the U.S. military is forced to retreat to its last distant bastion, Guam. Xi's Mahanian vision. This strategic vision is more than just military dominance. It is the fulfillment of a long-held national ambition, a concept rooted in the classic geopolitical theory of Alfred Mahan, that global power is defined by sea power and control over vital choke points. By securing Taiwan, Xi Jinping achieves 4 interlocking strategic goals simultaneously. First, the psychological triumph. The century-old humiliation of foreign containment is over. China is no longer a continental power, it is a true, unconstrained maritime giant. The symbolism alone validates the Communist Party's claim to absolute national destiny. Second, the strategic depth. The Chinese defense perimeter immediately extends thousands of miles into the Pacific. This forces the U.S. and its allies to expend enormous resources just to reach the contested area, turning every reinforcement effort into a slow, high-risk operation. The threat of conventional attack on the mainland is virtually eliminated. The nuclear deterrent. The deep-water sanctuary of Taiwan's eastern coast grants the PLN submarine fleet the ability to perform silent, effective nuclear patrols, a capability that places China's nuclear deterrent on par with, or even superior to, the United States' in the Pacific theater. The fourth, the global trade dictate. Control over the waters surrounding Taiwan means control over one of the world's busiest commercial waterways, through which 50% of global container traffic passes. This is a massive, permanent chokehold on global commerce, making Beijing the silent dictator of world trade. In the grand calculus of Beijing, the short-term economic shock of sanctions and isolation is a necessary cost for the permanent strategic gain. A future world where the U.S. can no longer guarantee the security of Japan or the Philippines, where U.S. power is pushed back to Guam and Hawaii,
is a world where China writes the rules. The war for Taiwan is therefore not a war over a small island. It is the war for the unraveling of the American-led world order. It is the decisive battle for the future of the Pacific. And by closing the door on the first island chain, Beijing doesn't just lock its rivals out, it locks itself into the unquestioned role of the next global hegemon.
To secure the Taiwan invasion, Beijing had to first secure its southern flank, and that required creating a legal and military justification for controlling one of the world's most vital waterways, the South China Sea. Their method? A map. A relic of the post-World War II chaos, formalized not in a treaty, but as a series of 9 ambiguous dashes that Beijing claims grants them indisputable sovereignty over nearly $5 trillion worth of annual global trade. This is the 9-dash line, and it is, by any modern measure of international law, an imperial fantasy. The 9-dash line carves out nearly 90% of the South China Sea, claiming not just a few remote islands, but massive swaths of ocean belonging to sovereign neighboring nations. Beijing asserts this claim based on vague historical maps of fishing routes and early exploration. The world pushed back. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague issued a landmark ruling, a unanimous decision that should have ended the argument forever. The Hague Tribunal concluded there was no legal basis for China to claim historic rights to resources within the areas of the 9-dash line. It was a complete repudiation of Beijing's claim under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Essentially, the world's highest court of maritime law declared the 9-dash line null and void. Beijing's response was immediate, contemptuous, and definitive. They rejected the ruling outright. They called the tribunal's decision a political farce. Why? Because the 9-dash line isn't a legal claim, it's a geopolitical pretext. It's the rhetorical armor that allows Beijing to build the military fortresses it needs for the only mission that truly matters, Taiwan. The South China Sea is not about fishing, oil, or gas. It is the logistical heart of the Taiwan invasion. It serves as the staging ground, the patrol zone, and the vital southern shield to prevent any U.S. or Allied intervention coming from the south. Securing this sea is the prerequisite for war in the north. Constructing the A2AD kill zone. The sound of heavy machinery, dredging, and explosions is overpowering, then fades to a metallic humming score. With the international legal challenge dismissed, China proceeded with the greatest act of territorial creation in human history, the building of artificial islands. Over a few short years, they transformed submerged reefs, features that under maritime law grant no sovereign territory, into fully militarized 3,000-meter runways, deep-water ports, and hardened missile shelters. They didn't build fishing docks, they built unsinkable aircraft carriers. These islands are the core components of Beijing's strategy to keep the United States out of a Taiwan conflict. That strategy is known as anti-access area denial, or A2AD. A2AD is not just a defensive concept. It is a sophisticated, layered system designed to turn any approaching enemy naval or air force, specifically the U.S. Navy and Air Force, into a kill zone. The strategic link to Taiwan. Here is the crucial, undeniable link to Taiwan. The artificial islands perform two vital functions in a Taiwan contingency. Function 1, the southern shield. The islands, armed with long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles like the dreaded DF-21D, carrier killer, and advanced radar, create a no-fly, no-sail zone across the entire southern approach to the Taiwan Strait.
Any U.S. aircraft carrier or amphibious task force attempting to sail north from Singapore or from any port in the Indian Ocean must now pass through this lethal gauntlet. The islands serve as a massive, forward-deployed deterrent. They tell Washington intervention will begin hundreds of miles away and it will be fought on our terms. Function 2. The staging area and logistics hub. A full-scale invasion of Taiwan requires a monumental effort in manpower, fuel, and munitions. The artificial islands, particularly those closer to the mainland, provide protected, hardened staging grounds. They allow the PLA to disperse and hide logistics stockpiles, avoiding the congestion and vulnerability of mainland ports. The military buildup in the South China Sea is entirely consistent with a Taiwan invasion scenario. They give Beijing the ability to manage the battlefield, to saturate the air and sea space with sensors and missiles, and to secure their rear before launching the main assault. Without the A2AD umbrella provided by these islands, any U.S. counterintervention would be significantly easier. The entire expansion across the South China Sea is a cold, calculated exercise in risk mitigation. By establishing the 9-dash line as a fact on the water, Beijing gave itself the political justification to ignore international law. By building the artificial fortresses, it gave the PLA the military capability to establish the A2AD kill zone, ensuring that the U.S. military cannot intervene cheaply or quickly. The result is a unified, seamless strategic environment. China's eastern coast and the Taiwan Strait are now protected by a permanent fixed shield extending thousands of miles to the south. The South China Sea is not a separate dispute. It is the logistical blueprint and the battle test for the Taiwan contingency. China has invested billions, violated international law, and alienated every neighbor to construct a fortress designed for one single ultimate purpose: to ensure that when the order to invade Taiwan is finally given, no foreign power, especially the United States, can stop it.
Before Beijing makes the ultimate move against Taiwan, they needed a live-fire psychological test of the world's resolve. That test was Hong Kong. The promise of one country, two systems was the diplomatic foundation upon which the peaceful handover of Hong Kong was built. It was also the template, the official assurance Beijing repeatedly offered to Taiwan for reunification. By 2020, Beijing decided the promise was a liability. The mass protests for democracy were not just a local problem. They were an ideological virus challenging the CCP's core premise that freedom leads to chaos and only one-party rule can deliver stability. The national security law was not simply a piece of domestic legislation. It was a geopolitical wrecking ball. Imposed directly by Beijing, it bypassed Hong Kong's legislature, effectively gutting the city's judicial independence, press freedom, and civil liberties overnight. The message to Taiwan was brutal and unambiguous. Your autonomy is temporary. Your legal protections are fictional. Your fate is inevitable. Hong Kong was not the main prize. It was the canary in the coal mine, the perfectly controlled laboratory experiment to measure the true cost of international outrage. The global silence, China's ultimate benefit. The global reaction was, by Beijing's calculus, a resounding success. The UK called the NSL a breach of the 1984 Joint Declaration. The U.S. imposed sanctions on a handful of officials. The condemnation was unanimous. The action was not. Countries like Australia, Canada, and the UK offered relaxed immigration policies for Hong Kongers fleeing the crackdown. This was a humanitarian escape valve, but it was not a deterrent. Beijing watched closely. They saw Western nations issue strongly worded statements, but the financial markets in Hong Kong barely flinched. The diplomatic cost was low.
Crucially, no major world power was willing to risk its massive trade relationship with mainland China over the fate of Hong Kong's freedoms. This failure of global nerve provided the CCP with a precious gift of intelligence, a clear line in the sand defining what the world would not do. The consensus was that the West would prioritize economic stability over democratic principles in a region under Beijing's direct control.
The conclusion drawn in Zhongnanhai was terrifyingly simple. The political cost for absorbing a territory is high but survivable, and the risk of a military counterintervention? Non-existent. Hong Kong confirmed that the world would not fight for freedom. Now, Beijing had to ensure the world could not fight for Taiwan's semiconductors. That requires a military that can not only repel intervention but guarantee victory on its own terms. The birth of the Blue Water Dragon. The second and most explicit warning sign of China's invasion readiness is the monumental, unprecedented transformation of the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan. For decades, the PLA Navy was a green water force designed primarily for coastal defense and regional skirmishes. No longer. Driven by the strategic imperative of Taiwan and the desire for global projection, Beijing has launched a shipbuilding program of a scale the world has not seen since World War II. Today, the PLA Navy is the largest navy in the world by hull count, surpassing the United States Navy. But it's not just about numbers. It's about quality and intent. Over 70% of China's warships have been launched since 2010. They are new, modern, multi-mission combatants designed explicitly to fight the U.S. and its allies in the open ocean, a blue water offensive fleet. Their goal is not to defend the coast, it is to dominate the Pacific. Every new destroyer, every new submarine is a direct, calculated investment in one mission: winning the war for Taiwan. The entire fleet is an invasion vehicle and a U.S. deterrence killer disguised as a global navy.
Fujian, the electromagnetic breakthrough. The ultimate symbol of this new ferocious navy is the Type 003 aircraft carrier, the Fujian. This ship is not a copy of older Soviet designs, like China's first two carriers. It is China's first domestically designed, flat-deck, catapult-assisted launch and arrested recovery CATOBAR carrier. But the technology inside the Fujian marks the true technological leap: the integration of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS. Before the Fujian, only the U.S. Navy's newest supercarrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, possessed this technology. EMALS allows China to launch heavier, fully loaded, and more advanced aircraft, including their new stealth fighter, the J-35, and the crucial KJ-600 Airborne Early Warning AEW aircraft. This is a game changer. The KJ-600, the carrier's eye in the sky, provides the radar coverage and command and control that China's old carriers could not support. It allows the Fujian Carrier Strike Group to coordinate air, sea, and electronic warfare operations far over the horizon, directly challenging the U.S. Navy's mastery of networked naval warfare. The Fujian signals the end of China's technological reliance. They have bridged the technological gap in naval aviation decades faster than anyone predicted. The key difference now is operational experience, but the platform is there. It is a warship built for the Taiwan scenario, to project overwhelming air power, to seize the strait and prevent any U.S. relief force from closing the distance. The amphibious threat and the Type 075 LHDs. While the carriers fight for air supremacy far out in the Pacific, the amphibious fleet is the true invasion arm. The Type 075 LHDs are behemoths,
the equivalent of America's large amphibious assault ships. They are designed to carry up to 30 helicopters, hundreds of vehicles, and thousands of ground troops. They are the steel lungs of an amphibious invasion, capable of launching a massive air assault and landing wave simultaneously. China now has several of these massive ships in service, complementing their existing fleet of smaller landing ships. This entire force structure is a massive, clear signal. They are not preparing for a blockade. They are preparing for an invasion. The combined capability of the Type 075 LHDs and the Type 055 destroyers, China's large multi-role cruisers, gives the PLA Navy the power to launch, sustain, and defend a full-scale, massive amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait, a task that only a select few nations on Earth would even attempt. This fleet is the physical embodiment of the CCP's renewed confidence that they can defeat any potential intervention. The final warning signs. Hong Kong was the political test. The Fujian and the Blue Water Fleet are the military test. Beijing has concluded that the world will complain but will not act decisively to stop the erosion of human rights. They are now building the naval might required to ensure that even if the world wanted to intervene for Taiwan, they simply couldn't. The most sophisticated technology, the largest fleet, the most ruthless political will. The warning signs are not subtle. They are printed in steel and signed in the bloodless crackdown of a once free city. The question is no longer if China is ready for invasion, but whether the Western world has the will to acknowledge that preparation has already turned into countdown.
If China's motive for Taiwan is passion and history, America's motive is cold, ruthless geometry. It is not about democracy, not primarily about shared values, and certainly not about an unconditional defense of a besieged ally. It is about a foreign policy instrument so cynical, so finely tuned, that it has maintained a volatile peace for 5 decades by perpetually lying to both sides. This is the policy of strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is a masterwork of geopolitical risk management. It's a strategy of dual deterrence, a masterful use of uncertainty to control the actions of two antagonists. First, the deterrence of China. Beijing is never certain that the U.S. military, the Seventh Fleet, the air bases in Japan will not intervene if they attack Taiwan. That uncertainty forces Beijing to plan for the worst-case scenario, a catastrophic war with the world's most powerful military. This elevates the cost of invasion high enough to make an attack politically reckless. Second, the deterrence of Taiwan. Taiwan is never certain that the U.S. will intervene if they unilaterally declare formal independence. This uncertainty prevents Taipei from taking the final provocative step that would instantly trigger a Chinese invasion. The genius of ambiguity is its flexibility. It means the U.S. maintains the right to decide whether or not to send American troops at the moment of crisis, free from any binding treaty obligation. Washington essentially forces both Beijing and Taipei to behave, keeping them perpetually off balance while preserving U.S. freedom of action, all without firing a single shot. This is not diplomacy. It's a strategic leash.
The cynical benefit, the U.S. payout. The policy is cynical because it allows the U.S. to reap all the rewards of defending a crucial position without paying the cost of commitment. What does the U.S. gain from this profitable uncertainty? 1. Maintaining the status quo at minimum cost.
Ambiguity keeps the peace while forcing Taipei to buy billions of dollars in U.S. weapons under the Taiwan Relations Act. The U.S. makes a profit on the arms sales, while the risk of actual deployment remains, technically, conditional. 2. The ultimate diplomatic bargaining chip. The fate of Taiwan, a potential war with China, is the greatest tool of leverage Washington possesses over Beijing. By keeping the Taiwan question open, every trade negotiation, climate discussion, or technology dispute is conducted under the shadow of a potential crisis the U.S. could escalate by simply changing its policy. 3. The excuse for Indo-Pacific presence. The existence of the unresolved Taiwan conflict provides the fundamental, perpetual justification for every U.S. base, every carrier deployment, and every defense budget increase across the entire Indo-Pacific region. Without the flashpoint of Taiwan, the massive forward deployment of U.S. forces is harder to rationalize to allies and domestic critics alike. For 5 decades, the U.S. has used strategic ambiguity to extract military and diplomatic value from Taiwan without ever guaranteeing its life insurance policy. They hold the island's fate in their hands, using it as the pivot point in a great power competition. The occasional, seemingly accidental statements by U.S. presidents about ending ambiguity are not gaffes. They are calculated voltage spikes designed to inject a sudden, terrifying dose of uncertainty into Beijing's calculus, resetting the deterrence balance when it begins to fray. The geometry of power, the first island chain. Now, we must peel back the layer of democracy talk and look at the pure geostrategic truth of why the U.S. cannot, under any circumstances, allow Taiwan to fall. It has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with maintaining the containment perimeter, the first island chain. Taiwan is the absolute anchor of this defense line. Its loss would not just be a defeat, it would be a cataclysmic regional repositioning that would cost the U.S. its dominant position in the Pacific forever. If China seizes Taiwan, the chain breaks. As we showed, the PLA Navy breaks out into the deep Pacific, forcing the U.S. defense perimeter back to the distant second island chain, Guam and Hawaii. Allies falter. Japan and the Philippines, instantly facing an overwhelming Chinese force on their doorstep, would be forced to question the U.S. security guarantee. This domino effect would lead to the disintegration of the U.S. alliance system in Asia, the single most effective tool of American global power. The Pacific becomes a Chinese lake. China's A2AD tone would expand exponentially, making any future U.S. intervention immensely costly and slow. The United States must defend Taiwan because failing to do so validates China's claim to regional hegemony. The geostrategic rationale is robust. Taiwan is the frontline state in China's campaign of territorial expansion. Abandoning Taiwan is equivalent to surrendering the entire Western Pacific without a fight. The cost of intervention is massive, but the cost of non-intervention, the loss of allies, the loss of strategic position, the loss of a decades-long presence, is exponentially higher. Democracy as a coincidence, not a motive. The argument for defending Taiwan is often framed in terms of its vibrant democracy, and while that plays powerfully in Western media and policy circles, history reveals a much colder reality. The U.S. commitment to Taiwan began in 1950 with the deployment of the 7th Fleet, decades before Taiwan was a democracy. In those years, Taiwan was a U.S. client state ruled by the Kuomintang under martial law. The U.S. defended Taiwan then for the exact same reason it does now: geostrategy. It was a crucial anti-communist outpost on the containment line, regardless of its government's nature. The shift to democracy in Taiwan is a convenient coincidence for Washington, not the underlying motive. It provides a moral shield for a purely pragmatic defense of U.S. interests.
It allows Washington to dress up a power play, the defense of the first island chain and the semiconductor supply, as a virtuous defense of freedom. Taiwan's democracy gives the U.S. a high-minded narrative, but the real motive is not to defend the rights of the Taiwanese people. It is to defend the architecture of U.S. power in Asia. The cold, calculated player. The United States is not an altruistic savior in the Taiwan Strait. It is a cold, calculated player. Its policy of strategic ambiguity ensures that it can control the tempo of the conflict, keep its enemies guessing, and maintain its forward military presence. Its strategic motive is to deny China regional hegemony by holding the anchor of the first island chain, a strategy that protects its economy, its allies, and its naval superiority. The democracy of Taiwan is the most valuable asset in this equation, but only because it serves the geostrategic need of the United States. The fate of 23 million Taiwanese people is not the end goal of U.S. policy. It is the indispensable means to the end of preserving American global power.
What if I told you the fate of your smartphone, your car, your microwave, your nation's defense systems, indeed, the very fabric of global civilization rests on a few square miles of factories on a tiny island you rarely think about? What if the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a nuclear missile or a stealth bomber, but a silicon wafer? This is the silicon shield. This is the undisputed, terrifying reality of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and it is the true hidden prize and the ultimate deterrent in the coming war for Taiwan. TSMC is not just a company, it is a monopoly on the future. It manufactures over 92% of the world's most advanced microchips. Not just any chips, but the cutting-edge processors that power artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and the next generation of military hardware. This is not a market share, this is a stranglehold. Taiwan's semiconductor industry does not merely supply the global economy, it holds it hostage. And because of this, the world's most powerful nations, particularly the United States, are locked into a silent, desperate pact. TSMC must never fall. The ecosystem of dependence, the titans bow. Consider the titans of global technology. Apple, every iPhone, every Mac, every iPad, powered by chips forged in TSMC's fabs. NVIDIA, the undisputed leader in AI and graphics processing, reliant on TSMC for its cutting-edge GPUs. Qualcomm, the backbone of global mobile connectivity, its Snapdragon processors fabricated by TSMC. AMD, a resurgent force in CPUs and GPUs, directly challenging Intel through TSMC's foundries. Even Intel, which once prided itself on its own manufacturing, is now increasingly turning to TSMC for its advanced process nodes. Every single one of these multi-billion-dollar companies, the very engines of the modern world, are utterly dependent on a handful of clean rooms in Taiwan. This isn't just about consumer electronics. TSMC chips are in our advanced military systems, our satellite communications, our critical infrastructure. If TSMC stopped, the implications for national security, for the economy, for everything are catastrophic. It's an unprecedented level of global single-point failure. This isn't just a supply chain, it's an interconnected nervous system, and Taiwan is the brain. The global economic collapse, the $10 trillion freeze. Imagine the unthinkable. China invades Taiwan, and in the chaos, TSMC's fabrication plants are either seized, destroyed, or rendered inoperable. This would not be a recession. This would be an instant global economic implosion.
A 2021 report by the Boston Consulting Group estimated that a sustained disruption to Taiwan's chip supply could cost the global tech industry $500 billion annually. That's a conservative estimate. Other projections put the global GDP loss at $10 trillion in the first year alone. This isn't about profit margins. This is about fundamental societal function. Healthcare, medical devices, life support systems, advanced diagnostic equipment all rely on these chips. Automotive, modern cars or computers on wheels. Production lines would grind to a halt for years. Defense, advanced missiles, surveillance systems, fighter jets, critical communications, crippled by lack of components. Data centers, the internet itself, the cloud infrastructure, AI development, starved of the processors that make them run. The world would be thrown back decades in technological capability. Innovation would cease. Unemployment would skyrocket. Governments would face unprecedented social unrest. The entire digital civilization we have built would experience a permanent, catastrophic outage.
China's dilemma, the self-inflicted wound. Even for Beijing, the TSMC factor presents a colossal dilemma. Option A, seize the fabs intact. This is the ultimate prize. If China could take control of TSMC's cutting-edge facilities, it would instantly achieve technological supremacy, solving its crippling chip dependency overnight. But modern fabs are incredibly complex. They require highly specialized engineers, who would likely flee, a vast global supply chain, which would instantly be cut off, and years of uninterrupted power and maintenance. A direct, forceful seizure risks destroying the very prize they seek. Option B, destroy the fabs. If Beijing knows it cannot seize them, the alternative is to destroy them, preventing them from falling into enemy hands or being used to rebuild the global supply chain elsewhere. But this would be a self-inflicted wound of unprecedented magnitude. China's own military, its burgeoning AI industry, its entire economy, all are heavily reliant on these same chips, or the global economy that produces them. China needs TSMC chips more than almost anyone. Their entire industrial upgrading strategy, their military modernization, their AI ambitions, all require access to these advanced nodes. Destroying TSMC would effectively set their own technological clock back decades and guarantee an instant deep global recession that would devastate their own economy. The Silicon Shield works both ways. It is a defense for Taiwan, but it is also a bomb attached to China's own aspirations. Forcing U.S. intervention, the corporate mandate. This is why the U.S. must intervene. Not necessarily for Taiwanese democracy, not purely for geopolitical positioning, but because the corporate mandate is absolute. The U.S. high-tech sector, its dominant corporations, and its national security infrastructure are inextricably tied to TSMC. If TSMC falls, U.S. innovation stalls. U.S. companies lose trillions. U.S. military technology becomes obsolete. The U.S. defense of Taiwan is, at its core, a corporate protection racket. It is a raw, cold calculation that the cost of intervention, even a potentially catastrophic war, is exponentially less than the guaranteed economic annihilation that would follow TSMC's destruction or capture. Washington is not just defending an island, it is protecting the entire U.S. high-tech ecosystem. It is protecting the shareholder value of its most powerful corporations and its technological edge of its military. This is why America's rhetoric, while couched in democratic ideals, always leads back to the same terrifying conclusion. If China moves on Taiwan, America will respond. Because failure to respond would mean surrendering the keys to the digital kingdom to Beijing and destroying the very engines of American economic power. The Silicon Shield is Taiwan's defense,
but it is America's corporate imperative.
Let's strip away the diplomatic niceties. Let's cast aside the rhetoric of democracy and shared values. The true, unvarnished motive for American intervention in a Taiwan conflict is not freedom, it is profit. It is the desperate, existential need to preserve American technological hegemony over China. For decades, the United States has enjoyed an unchallenged lead in cutting-edge technology. That lead translates directly into military superiority, economic dominance, and global influence. But China, through relentless state investment and aggressive industrial espionage, is rapidly closing that gap. The competition between the U.S. and China is not merely a geopolitical rivalry. It is a new Cold War fought not with missiles, but with microchips. The prize is not territory, but technological supremacy. And in this high-stakes game, TSMC is the ultimate kingmaker. The U.S. views TSMC not as a Taiwanese asset, but as a critical de facto extension of its own technological ecosystem. Its continued independence, and crucially, its control by pro-Western forces is non-negotiable for Washington. This isn't about protecting Taiwan. It's about protecting the source code of American power. The road to technological vassalage. Imagine the nightmare scenario for Washington. Beijing successfully seizes TSMC and, against all odds, manages to integrate its advanced foundries into China's own industrial base. This isn't just about making phones. This is about strategic autonomy. If China controls TSMC, they control the global choke point for advanced semiconductors. Every major U.S. tech company, every advanced defense contractor would effectively become a technological vassal to Beijing. Iocoin, innovation controlled. China could dictate which U.S. companies get access to cutting-edge processes and under what terms. Iocoin, supply chain vulnerability. They could prioritize their own industries, starve U.S. competitors, or impose punitive tariffs on chip exports. Iocoin, military dependence. Imagine the U.S. military being forced to rely on chips fabricated under Beijing's direct control for its next-generation weapons systems. This is a complete and irreversible reversal of global power.
If China gains control of TSMC, they don't just gain an economic advantage, they gain extinction-level strategic leverage over the United States. They would be able to slow down, throttle, or completely shut off the flow of advanced chips to any country they choose. It would be the ultimate economic weapon, far more potent than any oil embargo. And it would immediately and permanently end U.S. technological leadership. This isn't mere competition. It's an unacceptable surrender of power. The U.S. cannot allow its technological future, and therefore its economic and military future, to be dictated by its chief geopolitical rival. The imperative of denial, destroying the jewel. This brings us to the darkest, most controversial aspect of the U.S. strategy. If China cannot be prevented from taking Taiwan, the U.S. will not allow China to acquire the jewel intact. The U.S. strategy is not just about defending TSMC. It is also about the denial option, the willingness, if necessary, to destroy the fabrication plants to prevent them from falling into Chinese hands. The U.S. views TSMC as a global public utility that cannot be controlled by an adversary. If it cannot be saved, it must be neutralized. The logic is brutal.
Better a global economic catastrophe that impacts everyone than a catastrophic power shift that permanently advantages China. This is the ultimate, terrifying outcome of the corporate protection racket. If you cannot protect your asset, you destroy it to prevent your enemy from gaining it. There's a tacit understanding within U.S. national security circles that if an invasion of Taiwan becomes imminent or successful and the fabs cannot be secured, then deliberate destruction is the only remaining option. It would be an act of economic self-immolation, but one deemed necessary to prevent a far worse strategic defeat. It's a scorched earth policy for the digital age. The mechanisms for such a denial are complex. They could involve pre-placed explosives within the facilities, cyber attacks designed to render the highly sensitive and interconnected machinery irrevocably inoperable, sabotage by departing Taiwanese or American personnel, direct military strikes on the facilities by U.S. or Taiwanese forces in the final moments. The details are classified, but the intent is clear. This is why the U.S. has invested billions in reshoring some semiconductor production, not to replace TSMC overnight, but to mitigate the fallout from its potential destruction, proving that the unthinkable is being planned for. Not freedom, but profit, the final motive. So when you hear U.S. officials speak of defending Taiwan, understand the layers of deception and strategic calculation. They speak of freedom and democracy because it resonates with the American public and aligns with an idealized self-image. But the real drivers are far more fundamental. Preservation of power, maintaining the first island chain and preventing China from breaking out into the Pacific. Economic supremacy, protecting the U.S. high-tech sector's absolute reliance on TSMC. Technological denial, preventing China from acquiring the ultimate strategic prize. The U.S. will help Taiwan because the alternative, a Chinese-controlled or destroyed TSMC, is a direct threat to America's economic engine, its military advantage, and its very position as a global hegemon. This is not a philanthropic endeavor. It is the cold, hard, unblinking reality of superpower competition. The U.S. will fight for Taiwan not because it cherishes Taiwanese independence, but because it cannot afford the trillions in lost profit and the permanent erosion of its global power that would follow a TSMC takeover. Taiwan is the battleground, but the real war is for the soul of the global economy, and in that war, for Washington, it's always about profit, not freedom.
The war for Taiwan will not begin with a battleship crossing the median line. It will begin in silence and darkness, on the digital battlefield. The first phase of the invasion is Zero Day, a preemptive cyber blitzkrieg designed to achieve functional decapitation of Taiwan's command structure and national will before the first physical shot is fired. China's objective is to sow chaos and paralysis. The attack will target Taiwan's critical infrastructure, electricity, water, telecommunications, and finance. The goal is to blind Taiwan's military, to prevent its commanders from communicating and its air force from scrambling. The C-5 ISSR system must be shattered. Simultaneously, a decapitation strike will be launched, not just cyber, but potentially kinetic. Military analysts believe Beijing may prioritize a short, sharp action against the military and political center of Taipei, a swift, massive missile and air assault designed to eliminate the civilian and military leadership, exploiting the concentrated geography of Taiwan's capital. The goal is not just to kill, but to exploit uncertainty in the continuity of government, forcing a standstill and potential capitulation before the U.S. or its allies can even convene an emergency meeting. China's use of deception and confusion will be paramount. They will move fast,
making the initial action look like a response to a Taiwanese provocation or a limited punitive strike. Anything to muddy the geopolitical waters and buy the crucial 48 to 72 hours necessary to establish a fait accompli before the global political machine can mobilize. The firestorm, missile and air superiority. As Taiwan reels from the digital and leadership frikes, the second phase begins, the joint firepower strike campaign. The sheer scale of this bombardment will dwarf any conflict since World War II. Thousands of DF, Dongfeng, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, some conventionally armed, some equipped with cluster munitions, will rain down on Taiwan. The primary targets are Taiwan's fixed military assets, runways, radar sites, ports, and missile batteries. Beijing's central military objective is aerial superiority. Without control of the air, the amphibious invasion is a non-starter. PLA Air Force fighters, supported by early warning aircraft like the KJ-600 flying from the newly operational Type 003 Fujian carrier, will saturate Taiwan's airspace. Taiwan's only hope in this phase rests on its hardened defenses, its missiles, fighters, and command centers hidden deep in the central mountain range. The goal is force preservation, to absorb the initial blow and keep enough mobile, asymmetric systems alive to fight back.
The bloody beaches, the amphibious challenge. The most difficult, bloodiest task of the invasion is the amphibious assault, the landing of hundreds of thousands of troops across the volatile Taiwan Strait. The challenges are monumental, making this one of the hardest military operations imaginable. Geography is the defense. Taiwan's west coast is dominated by cliffs, marshes, and only 14 beaches deemed suitable for a massive amphibious landing. The PLA must land on these predictable, well-defended choke points. The logistical hell. To achieve success, China needs to offload massive amounts of fuel, armor, and troops in a tiny window of opportunity. Every one of the PLA's new Type 075 landing helicopter docks, LHDs, civilian ferry ships disguised as troop carriers, and amphibious vehicles becomes a massive, slow target in the Strait's shooting gallery. Weather's wrath. The Taiwan Strait is notoriously unpredictable, subject to typhoons and rough seas, which severely limit the number of days per year suitable for an invasion. Taiwan's defense doctrine is built around the overall defense concept, ODC, a Porcupine Strategy designed to maximize cost and attrition. The central tenet is destruction of the enemy at the landing beach. Taiwan will use a massive swarm of asymmetric weapons, thousands of sea mines, fast attack missile boats, mobile anti-ship batteries, and long-range fires hidden in the mountain bunkers. The PLA must fight not just for the beach, but for every foot of the coastal plain against a defender who knows the terrain intimately. Urban hellscape, the final fight. Even if the PLA achieves a beachhead, the war has just begun. The battle shifts immediately to the most brutal, resource-intensive form of combat, urban warfare. Taiwan's coastal plains are densely populated. The landing sites often lead directly into sprawling cities. Taiwan's reserve forces, mobilized and integrated into the brutal calculus of urban defense, will aim to turn every block, every apartment complex, and every narrow street into a death trap for the advancing mechanized Chinese forces. Tanks and armored personnel carriers, so dominant in open battle, become vulnerable targets in the constricted, debris-filled streets. Logistical convoys become easy targets for ambushes. Taiwan's strategy shifts from beach defense to decisive battles in the littoral zone, aiming to bleed the PLA dry, forcing the staggering human and material cost high enough to trigger the political collapse of the invasion's will in Beijing. The invasion of Taiwan would be a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The PLA's objective is a swift victory. Taiwan's objective is to make the battle so long, so bloody, and so politically disastrous that the cost of reunification becomes higher than Beijing is willing to pay. The entire island becomes a giant kill zone. The global economic tsunami. Regardless of the outcome of the battle, the moment the invasion begins, the global financial and economic system shatters. This is the catastrophic global reaction that Beijing must weigh. 1. Instant economic decoupling. The United States and its allies, Japan, Australia, the UK, and the EU, would trigger a nuclear sanctions response. This means the full, immediate freezing of Chinese assets held in Western currencies, cutting off Chinese banks from the SWIFT international payment system, and a comprehensive trade embargo. This would be far more devastating than the sanctions imposed on Russia, given China's far deeper integration into the global economy. 2. The chip famine. The TSMC silicon shield is instantly neutralized. The loss of 92% of advanced chip production means a guaranteed, immediate, and deep global recession. Trade would be choked. Production lines across the globe, from automotive to defense, would cease, and the global financial markets would enter a state of utter panic. 3. Alliance mobilization. The U.S. will not be alone. While NATO nations may limit themselves to sanctions, Japan and Australia would almost certainly join the U.S. in military support, providing basing, reconnaissance, and potentially direct military engagement. The war instantly becomes a regional conflict between major nuclear-armed powers. The invasion of Taiwan is the single-point failure for the modern interconnected world. The human cost will be in the tens of thousands, the economic cost will be in the trillions, and the strategic cost is the risk of nuclear escalation between two great powers, neither of which can afford to lose. The planners in Beijing know this. The scenario is horrifyingly clear. The only question left is the final price.
We have traveled into the heart of the world's most dangerous flashpoint. We have dismantled the propaganda and revealed the naked, terrifying truth. The war for Taiwan is not a simple war. It is a collision of three absolute, immovable forces that guarantee a global catastrophe. First, the historical wound. For Beijing, this is the final, unfinished act of the Civil War. It is the existential imperative of national rejuvenation, the sacred, non-negotiable mission of President Xi Jinping to complete the reversal of a century of humiliation. Taiwan's continued autonomy is a daily ideological threat to the CCP's right to rule. Second, the geopolitical chess game. For the U.S. and its allies, this is the defense of the first island chain, the strategic anchor that holds the entire American security architecture in Asia together. Taiwan is the cork in the bottle, and its capture means China breaks out into the Pacific, rendering U.S. bases obsolete and shattering the post-WW2 world order. The fight is for hegemony, pure and simple. Third, the corporate profit. And beneath all the flags, all the history, lies the coldest motive of all, the silicon shield. The TSMC $1.5 trillion jackpot, the company that holds a terrifying monopoly on the world's most advanced microchips. The U.S. defense of Taiwan is ultimately a corporate protection racket, a realization that the cost of war is less than the cost of global economic annihilation that would follow TSMC's destruction or seizure.
The invasion of Taiwan is therefore inevitable because the three competing motivations, historical imperative, geostrategic necessity, and corporate greed, have aligned to make the crisis non-negotiable for all parties involved. The imminent threat, the final price. The war is not a distant possibility. The warning signs are everywhere. We saw the psychological test of Hong Kong, where the world's meek response confirmed for Beijing that the political cost of annexation is survivable. We tracked the building of the ferocious Navy, the Fujian carrier, and the Type 075 amphibious fleets built for one purpose, to ensure that if the world wanted to intervene, the PLA would be strong enough to destroy the incoming U.S. 7th Fleet. We detailed the zero-day cyber blitzkrieg and the bloody beaches, the sheer horrifying scale of the amphibious assault required, which will result in a humanitarian catastrophe of unparalleled proportions. The economic fallout is not a maybe, it is a guarantee. The moment the first missile flies, the world economy enters a state of shock that makes 2008 look like a minor market correction. Trillions of dollars will vanish, global trade will choke, and the modern digital civilization will instantly begin to seize up, starved of the tiny components it needs to function. The price of silicon is not measured in dollars. It is measured in global instability, human lives, and the potential end of the technological age we currently inhabit. The call to action. Your life is at stake. Do not think this is just a crisis that belongs to Beijing or Washington. This crisis belongs to you. Look around you. The car you drive, which relies on a dozen microchips, will stop being manufactured. The hospital that treats your loved ones, with its networked ventilators and imaging machines, will struggle to repair and maintain them. The advanced computing systems that secure your bank account, your electric grid, and your national defense, all dependent on chips that are forged in a handful of factories in Taiwan. This is not a historical documentary about a past conflict. This is a live warning about the single most critical, dangerous flashpoint on Earth. The fate of Taiwan is not just the fate of an island. It is the fate of our technological world. When you buy your next device, when you look at your investment portfolio, when you hear the next aggressive statement from Beijing, remember the invisible lines we've exposed. Remember the historical wound, the geopolitical chess, and the corporate profit. Because when the clock runs out and the invasion begins, the global economy won't just crash. The lights will go out on the 21st century. The question is not if the war is coming, but whether we, the global citizens, will acknowledge the price of silence before the final countdown hits zero.